Okay, so last week we were talking about the the gray area of the rights of a landowner versus the rights of a neighbor when there's a certain sensitivity that the neighbor has towards smell or towards sound. What are the limits of that sensitivity? And the last thing that we saw in the Imrei Yaakov was that anything that is commonly done on a homeowner's property, as far as noise, as smell, and so forth, is reasonable for him to continue his activity despite the neighbor's sensitivity to the to the noise. Okay, and that's really what I want to sort of discuss further today in this section in the Biurim, which starts with the words Choli Harosh Umazik Lo Kol Haka'a. He says, Mistimas Hadvarim, he says, the simple import of the words that the Rav Shulchan Aruch had said that if a guy is suffering from migraines, then I, as his neighbor, have to accommodate his sensitivity to noise. He says, it sounds like the dafka hecha diika choli demazik lo hakol tzarach lihimana mezeh. He says, it sounds like if he has an illness where noise is annoying to him or is harmful to him, then I have to refrain from that noise making. Aval b'deleka chole, avsha hakol mafriya lo, mikol makom eno yachol limchot. But he says, well, let's say the person is not ill, but just it's a very annoying noise that I'm making on my property. And it may make it hard for him to fall asleep. Then that neighbor doesn't seem to have a right to protest because he can't make the claim that it's affecting his health. I'm not sure who that commentary is. The hezek shmiya lo shamanu dishmei hezek. That auditory damage is not called damage. In other words, when I make a type of annoying sound, a nuisance sound, that's not considered to be damage according to halacha. He says, "V'lo nimtza imadi sefer hanala ayin bo." He says, I don't have that particular sefer that was cited in order to examine it carefully. Ach nechazi anan ma das harishonim bazeh. But at least we could do a review of what the Rishonim opine on this matter as far as offensive noises. Can they be considered to be a form of damage and allow me to protest and prevent my neighbor from making noise? Benafkamina gamle inyan mazgan. He says, and this has ramifications for what's called a mazgan in Hebrew, or an air conditioner. Now remember, this is being written, 40 years ago maybe? It's not a huge amount of time. But in Eretz Yisrael, air conditioners, where this is being written, air conditioners were not a commonplace thing. And people would install wall units in their homes. There was very little central air conditioning where Rabbi Stern lived. And a guy decides he wants to put an air conditioner, this is probably in Yerushalayim, I would imagine. Shetoin Ruven shemafriya lo harash ve'enu yachol lishon. That Ruven is one neighbor. He doesn't have an air conditioner, so he keeps his windows open in a hot summer night. And Shimon has a wall unit, and
sorry, Rabbi, these are the ones that fit in the window, yes?
Yeah, and right. And Reuven is complaining that I can't sleep from the noise of your noisy air conditioner. Remember, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, whenever this is being written, probably 40 years ago, air conditioner wall units were a little bit noisy at night. Okay, does Reuven therefore have a right to limit Shimon's activity of operating his air conditioner? So he says, "V'hinei b'bavavasra chafa midbeis tanan chanus shebechatzer yachol limchos biyado v'lomer lo eini yachol lishon mikol hanichnasin umikol hayotzin. The Gemara now does say that if a person opens up a store in a courtyard where there wasn't previously a store, the neighbor is allowed to protest and say that I cannot sleep because of the constant traffic that's coming in and out of the store. It's interrupting with my sleep. People are making noise. Aval osa kelim yotze umocher b'toch hashuk ve'enu yochol limchos biyado v'lomar eini yochol lishon. Sorry, lo mikol hapatish v'lo mikol harechayim v'lo mikol hatinokot. But then the Gemara does, however, allow a manufacturer to manufacture pottery or metal pots, and the neighbor does not have the right to protest from the sound of the hammer, from the sound of a mill, and from the sound of a crying baby. So there are certain things that you're allowed to protest, but there are certain sounds that you're not allowed to protest. If a person is using his home for business and it's not creating traffic, then you can't protest the noise. But if a person sets up an operation in his home which causes traffic to come in, and the pedestrian traffic causes noise, you are allowed to protest. And the question, of course, is what's the distinction? What's the difference between the two? He says, and the Rishonim, the medievalists, disagree as to how to properly interpret the distinction that the Mishnah is drawing. He says, why is there a difference? Why do I have a right to protest for the foot traffic and the people who are talking and making noise because they're preventing me from sleeping, and yet I don't have a right to protest if a person sets up a blacksmith or some kind of millstone in his backyard, where I don't have a right to protest. Now, we had seen in the Rav Shulchan Aruch that if a person has a migraine, then I can prevent someone from milling crunchy things that create a noise. And so, but the Mishnah says that you can't. So the question is, of course, where do you draw the line? V'huvu divreihem beis Yosef siman kuf nun vav. And the different opinions are cited by the Beis Yosef. So we're going to do a little bit of a review. I don't think we're going to be able to go through the entire piece that he's bringing. We'll see how far we can get until we get to the conclusion. So first we have Rabbeinu Yerucham. He's one of the Rishonim, and he writes, "Daha de'ena yachol limchos biyado v'lomer ena yachol lishon mikol hapatish ze amor davke hecha shekvar hechzik lasos kain." He says the reason why you can't protest the blacksmith from using his hammer is because he was there first, and he's already established a precedent of being able to use that, being able to engage in that activity in his home. And so you, as a neighbor, do not have a right to protest. Kolomar shim hechzik kvar kederech shemachzikim lenezikin az eno yachol limchos biyado. And so Rabbeinu, that's the distinction that Rabbeinu Yerucham draws. He says it depends what kind of precedent was already set in the courtyard for noisemaking. If there was aval ilo hechazik v'rotza achshav lasos malachazu b'veiso ma'akvin alav. He says, but if a fellow has a quiet, bucolic neighborhood, and all of a sudden a guy wishes to set up a blacksmith anvil and hammer in his backyard, he doesn't have a right to do that, and the neighbor does have a right to put a stop to it. So that's the distinction. He says if the store with the foot traffic was always there and you move in as a new neighbor, you don't have a right to stop it, just like you don't have a right to stop the blacksmith's hammer. But if a person wants to do it anew, then you do have a right to protest. V'chein kasav hasmag, v'chein nir midivrei harambam, Hilchos Shchenim, etc. He says that the Smag and the Rambam seem to say the same thing. Because of Sham Hamagid Mishnah, Shetamu Mipnei Shehuk Shalo Matam Ein Tana Sutaina B'Kol HaPatish. And the Magid Mishnah, who's a commentary in the Rambam, explains that the Rambam maintains this distinction. He says, because I don't understand. Why can't you make a larger protest if a guy's hammering away all day? He says, doesn't a banging hammer create more of a nuisance for someone who's trying to sleep than foot traffic coming in and out of a place? Mishum kach ein limchos bo. And so the Rambam says, like Rabbeinu Yerucham, that it has to do with who was there first and what's precedents were already established. Aval b'chanut hagam shehechzik ein cheskasu chazaka etzol hanichnasim v'hayotzim. He says, when it comes to foot traffic for people coming in and out of the guy's courtyard, he says, even if that was already set as a precedent, the neighbor still has a right to interrupt and to stop it. Why? He says, "V'tam hadavar de bechanut lamoel chazaka, bir hadrisha, the whole v'hanichnasim enam anashim miyuchadim, the hayom nichnazeh u'lumachar zeh, mishum hachi lo mahani chazaka dezeh legabi da'acher shaba machar." He says it's a very interesting argument. He says the logic is different customers come on different days. So just because customer A comes on Mondays has no bearing on the rights of the customers who come on Tuesdays. So the argument goes like this. I can stop the customers from coming on Tuesday just because the guy who's coming on Monday has no bearing on the activities of the customers that come on any other day. There's a whole variety of different customers, and one customer's rights of access has no bearing on another customer's rights of access. So there's no such thing as a collective chazaka of people. You view each person as an individual, and since no one individual has established sufficient precedent of coming in and out of this courtyard and making noise, I can protest the totality of this operation, even if he was there first. That's the argument that some wish to make, that the Drisha wishes to make. And that would be the distinction between a precedent that was established by one singular blacksmith versus a whole cacophony of customers who are walking into a neighborhood. I'm not sure if I'm satisfied with that argument, but that's the argument that is being suggested over here. Okay. He says, "Mashen came legabe atzmo shehu ha'osem malacha tamid al pi derech zeh shel harishonim halalu." So he says, basically, based on so this is one group of medievalists who approach it this way, that when a precedent is set by one individual, even though it's noisy, you cannot protest. He says, according to this, Yotze diyesh din shel hezek shmiya shel hashmaas kol d'chol zman shelo hechzik bo yachol shcheno limchos bo. He says, it would turn out that if a person wishes to set up a new blacksmith, where there was none previously, then I, as a neighbor, would have a right to protest. Okay, that's really what the implication is. Okay, so that's argument number one. But now we have another opinion, and this other opinion is Avol Me'idach Haramban v'Harashba Yesh Lahem Shita Acheres Bevir HaMishnah. So these two other Rishonim, the Ramban and the Rashba, they have a different way of understanding the distinction in the Mishnah. Well, the Divreihem Din HaChanut Sheyachol La'akev Zelo Mishum Kol HaNichnasim V'Yotzim Mamish Ka'omar. He says, the reason why I have a right to protest the pedestrian traffic of a guy who's got a retail operation is not just because of the noise that the pedestrians make. And to wit, if it was only a matter of noise, I can't stop noise being made, just like I can't stop the hammer and the mill from operating. But rather it's because the amount of traffic is impeding my access to my home. which means it's preventing me from getting into my apartment in a timely fashion so that I can go to bed quickly. When I get home, I see a long line waiting to get into my courtyard, and I have to move through a whole bunch of people. He says, Ubir Sham Bidrisha, She'eni Yachol Lisham de Kamer b'Masnisim, Lavdafka Kamer, Elokilu Kamer, Hein Torden Osi, Be'eshani Bola Amod Velisham. He says, these are people who are disturbing me by impeding my access to my home because of all of the foot traffic that's going on. It's got nothing to do with noise, according to the Ramban and the Rashba, because they learn that noise is not an actionable form of damage, according to the Ramban and the Rashba. Gam divrei ha-Tosfos b'sugya sham matim l'derech hanal. He says Tosfos seems to be saying the same thing. If you look at Tosfos' commentary over there, Ulashita zu leka klal din shel hezek kol. And according to this opinion, the second opinion, there's no such thing as auditory damage. V'rak heicha di'ika riboy haderech shel nichnasim v'yotzim b'chanut bazeh yachol la'akeh. He says, and gam mishut harivash simikuf tzarivav muchach da'azul b'shita zu v'yuval l'kaman ve'efshir dezehu kavanoso shel hamaharikash shehevi b'reish devarenu shekosav dehezek shemiya lo shamanu. He says, and it could be that was the sefer that I referenced at the beginning of this discussion, who says that there's no such thing as auditory damage. Okay, so we've seen now two different schools of thought on this matter. One opinion is that as long as there's no precedent, you are allowed to protest new noise that's being made in your neighborhood. According to the second opinion, auditory disturbance is not actionable at all. So he says, "Ulam adayin tzarich iyun madua kasav kein b'pshitus harei de'emes depligi bei harishonim ubifrata beis Yosef b'shulchan aruch siman kuf nun vav sif beis pasuk kedas harambam b'siyato diyachol limchos neged kol hapatish." What I don't understand is that sefer that I quoted at the very beginning. Why does he side with the latter opinion and not the former opinion, especially in light of the Rambam's opinion that you are allowed to protest loud noises? The kavanos shel hamarikash lomar she'ein lachayiv shekein laharchik shochen laharchik atzmo livnos kosel kedei shelo yishma ma shechaveru medaber dehezek shmiya lo shamanu dishmei hezek b'tzarach iyun. So, and it's very possible that what the Maharikash is saying is that in light of the fact that there is a machlokes as to whether auditory damage is considered actionable, I have no right to force my neighbor to distance his activity, because my neighbor could always say, well, I paskin like the Rashba and the Ramban. Even though you may paskin like the Rambam, but I paskin like the Rashba and the Ramban. And we've seen this idea before, right? In other words, whenever two Jews are in a dispute and one Jew says, well, I defend my behavior based on Rabbi so-and-so, even though you feel that Rabbi so-and-so is wrong, you can't compel me to abide by your rabbi, since I have a rabbi who takes my side. And that's essentially perhaps what he's saying. He says, okay, so anyway, so that would at least explain perhaps why that sefer says that auditory damage is not actionable. But then he goes on and he says, Amna me'idach harama kasav b'shem yesh omrim d'chol ma she'osa b'chanusa b'beiso afilu lechatchila inan yocholim limchos d'varav yivu'aru l'kaman. But now we have the Shita of the Ramah, who's the author, one of the two authors of the Shulchan Aruch. And the Ramah writes that any activity that a person is doing within his store in order to conduct normal business, even though it makes noise, cannot be acted upon, cannot be prevented or stopped. And we have to understand what the parameters of the Ramah are, which we will momentarily. But before we do that, he says, "V'hine yesh od shita b'rishonim v'hishita samordechai b'shem Rabbeinu Yoel." But there's a third opinion that we haven't seen yet, which is that of the medievalists. This time it's the Mordechai, who says the spherule de kol hanichnasim hakavana lekol mamash velo leriboy haderech v'yesh chiluk beinim hakol bamei hachatzer debazeh yachol limchos. And the Mordechai draws a distinction between the noise of the pedestrians versus the noise of the hammer in the following way. He says, when the noise is coming from the courtyard itself, then I'm allowed to protest. He says, whatever noise is being made in the courtyard is actionable, since all of us have a shared portion of ownership of that courtyard. If noise is being made in the courtyard, then I have a right to protest. But the Mordechai says, and here's the difference. He says, when I'm hammering away in my store or in my house, then you cannot prevent me. Since it's coming from my property, even though the noise travels, I have a right to do what's on my own property, whatever I want, even if the noise travels from my property. And that's the distinction that the Mordechai draws. He says that the reason why I can protest the foot traffic and the noise of the foot traffic is because it's being made in a commonly shared area. But the sound of the hammer is being made on my own privately owned property, and that's why you cannot protest. So that's a third distinction to draw. Uvedrisha sirle dechein hu das hatur umasik sham sof sifkat and ches the kiven the harash b'vaharamban the toisus umordechai v'hatur kulam b'chadashita kaini the afilu below hechazik enam yecholam nimchos neged kol hapatish al kol panim b'soch beis. So near the Hilchos Kavasai. And so the Drisha, who's a commentary on the Tur, states that we have a consortium of Rishonim who now opine that as long as a person is making noise on his own property, that's not actionable. Whether it's because auditory damage is not considered damage or because auditory offensiveness that is created on my own property is not actionable. But the commonality is that a neighbor does not have a right to stop noise that's being made on my own property. That's how we pass. Below Kebeis Yosef shepasek Harambam v'Rabbeinu Yerucham Usmag, and not like the Beit Yosef, who paskins like the Rambam and those other medievalists who say that noise is actionable. Gam habach kosav. So now we have a major machlokas over here between the Beis Yosef and between the Tur. Ulefize nafgalon. It would therefore turn out the mazgan hapoel al yedei ra'ash gadol shelo kederech ha'olam. He says, and therefore what it would turn out is that if a person has a particularly noisy air conditioner, which is not the norm, okay, it's not standard noise that is emanating from a person's property. He says, as long as the air conditioner noise originates on his own property, then the neighbor cannot protest, according to that school, according to that group. Below bazeh bilvad ela af imha madchas shel hamazgan nimtza b'chotzer hashutfim. He says, I'll go even further. Let's say the motor of the air conditioner is protruding out of the guy's window and is now in a common area of the courtyard. He says, the ladaitam yachol la'akev alav mikol makom ladas haramban v'harash v'hatos v'harivash enu yachol la'akev. But there's still that small group of Rishonim, the Ramban, the Rashba, and the Tosfos, who hold that hezek shmiya lav shmei hezek, that auditory damage is not actionable, period, even when it's in a shared area. He says, the ladaitam rak beriboy haderech yeshiku v'lo behezek kol bilvad ve'efshir di'acholomar kimli kedaitam ve'ein biyado limchos bo. And therefore, this person could always make the argument and say that I paskin like those Rishonim who say that auditory nuisances are not actionable. He says, I'm going to skip the parentheses. But we haven't yet analyzed, even though we've seen three opinions of the Rishonim, the Ramah is not a Rishon. The period of the Rishonim goes up to around the year 1500 in the secular calendar. The Ramah is writing his Shulchan Aruch commentary the same time as the Beit Yosef of Yosef Karo in the 16th century. So therefore, we've seen what the Rishonim have to say. Now we have to look at the Shulchan Aruch. The Ramah in the Shulchan Aruch gives this very obscure opinion, which basically says the chol masha osa b'chanusa ubeveso afilu lechatchila einon yecholim limchos ad kam l'shana. That he says that anything that a person is doing in his store or in his house, you're not allowed to protest. Umilashon ze mashma v'pashtus dedavkim osa beveso u'vishuso hadin kach. Masha'en kenim osa b'chatzor shumakam meshutaf l'kulam eino rashai. And therefore, it sounds like from the language of the Ramah that if a person is doing it in a shared area, then you do have a right to protest. So what I'm going to do now is, because it's getting late, we'll have to continue this essay tomorrow. Let's just review where we are now so we'll get our bearings for tomorrow's resumption of the discussion. We have three opinions in the Rishonim. Opinion number one, auditory nuisances are actionable. That's the Rambam and his school. Then we have the Ramban and the Rashba, that auditory nuisance is not actionable. Hezek Shemiya Lav Shmei Hezek. And then we have a third opinion that says that it all depends on where the noise is being made. If it's being made on a shared area, the neighbors have a right to protest. If it's not being made on a shared area, but on my own private property, the neighbors do not have a right to protest. We have yet to explain the Ramah in detail, what his opinion is, whether it's a fourth opinion or whether it's part of one of these three opinions. And Emir Hashem will cover that tomorrow. I hope you can join us for the 6:45 minyan outside, because I want to make sure that we have an opinion. And